Imagine living in a nice residential area in 1960s Argentina. Your next-door neighbours for the past 15 years are a family of friendly, well-spoken, respected Germans. One fine day, you are startled by screams at your neighbour's house. But when you go outside to find out what was happening, a group of mean-looking Mossad agents tells you to back off. You watch as they capture the most dangerous Nazi leader alive, the architect of the Holocaust responsible for millions of deaths. This is the story of how the Allies first and Israeli task forces later hunted, executed, and imprisoned some of the worst criminals in the history of the world. For decades, these despicable gangsters thought they had eluded the long arm of the law. War crimes, however, never prescribe, and the tireless efforts of men and women made sure they paid for them. Welcome to the Marshall Memoirs. A bitter end for the Thousand-Year Reich. By late 1944, it had become obvious to Axis and Allies alike that the tide of the war had turned decisively against Nazi Germany. The once impenetrable Third Reich began a rapid descent into chaos. Hitler lost control over his army, who turned against him. Operation Valkyrie, an emergency plan intended to secure governance even under heavy enemy fire, was turned into a plot by the German army leaders to assassinate Hitler and take control of the crumbling country. Hitler's death was required for the plan to work, in order to free the German soldiers from their solemn oath to the Führer. However, this plan failed, and Hitler remained the highest authority in the Third Reich until 1945. While the British and Americans were occupied with the liberation of France, by early 1945, Soviet forces pushed from the east, getting closer and closer to Berlin. Nazi strategists came and went to the Führer's bunker, unable to stop the massacre of their own troops. Many German cities had surrendered to the bombing campaigns, and Hitler and his officials realized their dream of a universal Reich was over. Berlin, the heart of the Reich, was a battleground. Adolf Hitler grew increasingly delusional and cut off from reality, especially since he retreated to his underground bunker. His propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, fed him a steady stream of lies about inexistent German victories, even when Soviet artillery fire could be heard not far from the bunker. Meanwhile, the German people struggled for survival. Food and basic necessities became scarce. Most cities were completely destroyed, forcing civilians into bomb shelters or fleeing into the countryside. Gauleiters, regional Nazi leaders, often remained in denial, clinging to power and resorting to increasingly brutal measures against dissenters and suspected deserters. Within the Nazi leadership itself, cracks began to show. On the 23rd of April, Hermann Göring sent Hitler a telegram asking to assume leadership of the regime, but this infuriated Hitler, who declared Göring a traitor to the Reich. He had no option but to flee south in the hopes of negotiating a separate surrender with the Allies. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, attempted to make contact with the Western Allies behind Hitler's back, but was ultimately captured and took his own life by biting into a capsule of arsenic. On the early morning of the 29th, a desperate Hitler married Eva Braun and dictated his last will and testament. News of the Soviet troops closing in on the bunker were becoming more alarming. At 3:30 p.m. on the 30th, a loud explosion was heard in the underground bunker, and SS troops found Hitler and Eva dead in their study. The troops had specific instructions of burning the bodies so that the Allied troops could not find them, and they never did. News of Hitler's death plunged Nazi Germany into further disarray. Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda took the same path by poisoning themselves and their 6 children. On May 2nd, with Berlin surrounded, Soviet forces finally stormed the Reichstag building, raising the red flag over the German capital. This marked the end of the Third Reich's physical existence. Fighting continued in Berlin and other German cities for a few days, but on May 7th, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the newly appointed president of the Reich, signed an unconditional surrender document, formally ending the war in Europe. But that did not mean that everything went back to normal. At that point, Allies started a race against the clock in order to find and prosecute the many Nazi war criminals that were now attempting to go undercover and start a new life as far from Germany as possible. Some of the most loyal Nazi officials, like Martin Bormann, Heinrich Himmler, and Robert Ley, chose to take their own lives over standing trial at Nuremberg. Others surrendered to the new authorities in the hopes of saving their lives. Hermann Göring, who was under house arrest for conspiring against Hitler, was freed on the 5th of May by a passing Luftwaffe unit, and he made his way to the US lines to surrender. He thought it was better to surrender to the Americans than to the Soviets, a thought which probably saved his life, considering how the Soviets had the custom of shooting Nazis on sight. Nazi criminals caught in Europe. Already before the end of the war, the Allies had made plans for an international court to judge the crimes of the Nazis in Europe. This meant they not only needed to catch the most Nazis, but also the witnesses who could testify against them. This included, of course, the wives of Nazi chiefs. Martin Bormann's wife Gerda tried to flee Germany with her 9 children. In the chaos of the Soviet invasion of Berlin, she claimed to be the director of a children's home with some of her children disguised as orphans. Gerda boarded a school bus with the children and managed to cross the border into Italy, stopping in the South Tyrol, where they were met by the Nazis' regional boss. He had secured a place to stash all Gerda's sensitive material and found them a home in a small village in a valley 30 miles from Bolzano. Though safe for the time being, Gerda was in dreadful agony. She had ovarian cancer and needed an operation as soon as possible. By then, the Allies were on her trail. 2 intelligence agents tracked her down and informed the British unit stationed in the area. Informed of her whereabouts by the doctor who diagnosed Gerda, a British Army major turned up on her doorstep. Gerda panicked, thinking he was going to take her to a concentration camp, but the major assured her that she was in no danger. Instead, she went straight to a hospital for prisoners of war in Murano. Surgery took place, but without effect. She died on the 23rd of March, 1946, a few months shy of her 37th birthday. Some lower-ranking Nazis who wanted to save their lives chose to collaborate with the American Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, the forerunner of the CIA. This was the case of Wilhelm Hertel, a SS major stationed in Austria. Hertel was a doctor in history who had made his whole career as an agent for the SIPO, or security police, as well as the SS. By the end of the war, he already knew Germany had few chances of winning the war, so he made several trips to Switzerland to talk to the OSS station chief in Bern. He was keen to ingratiate himself with the Americans, giving them information about Axis military preparations for a desperate last stand in the so-called Alpine Redoubt, as well as about gold shipments that were to be buried deep in the Austrian mountains. Unfortunately for Hertel, events overtook him, and before he could reach an agreement with the Americans, the Russians reached the outskirts of Berlin. Hertel made a final attempt to reach Switzerland at the beginning of May, but with French troops on the Austro-Swiss border, he was forced to stop when he had reached Liechtenstein and returned to seek refuge in Austria. In May 1945, he surrendered himself to American authorities in Bad Aussee. He was then taken to Germany until, in October 1947, he was transferred to Austria and confined in Lager Klesheim, Salzburg. During this time, Hertel figured prominently as a prosecution witness at the Nuremberg trials. In December 1947, he was released from prison as part of an agreement with the US authorities and began working for American intelligence, conducting espionage against the Communist Party of Austria in the post-war years. He subsequently became a published author and a successful spy. But not all the Nazis were so lucky. Rudolf Höss, the vicious commandant at Auschwitz responsible for more than 2.5 million deaths of Jews, managed to hide for almost 5 months after the war ended. He laid low and started working under a false identity as a farmer in a rural part of North Germany, near the border with Denmark. It was his wife, who had been found first by American intelligence agents, who gave away his location. 2 US Army units surrounded the farmhouse and surprised Höss in his pajamas. He was later taken to the grounds of Auschwitz, where he was hanged barely a block away from where he had lived with his family until 1945. Codename Odessa. On the 3rd of July, 1946, the United States Army Counterintelligence Corps sent a memo to the president stating that they found out the Nazis had been preparing escape routes at least since 1944. They named this operation Odessa, an acronym for Organization of Former SS Members. To this day, it is unclear whether this was a concerted effort by the Nazi administration or just a series of backup plans organized by small factions within the German government. The truth is, networks were set up so that at least some Nazis could leave the country undetected, and in a way they were extremely successful. At least 300 Nazis found their way to Argentina alone. Other popular hiding places included Paraguay, Brazil, and the Middle East. In total, some 10,000 people affiliated to the Nazi Party managed to leave the country before 1945 ended. While many scholars have pointed out the complicity of the Vatican, the Red Cross, and even the United States Army, the truth is that controlling each and every person attempting to exit a destroyed country was simply an impossible task. Thus, many Nazis disguised themselves as refugees, took false identities, or applied for help from these organizations. It was only much later that the CIA, the Mossad, and the MI5 made serious efforts to track, identify, and catch Nazi criminals all over the world. The first task after the war ended was normalizing the former Reich and rebuilding the German state. Whether Odessa existed as such or only in the imaginations of CIA operatives in Virginia, the networks are a reality that helped tens of thousands of war criminals to elude punishment, at least at first. Some 90% of Nazi perpetrators who escaped Europe are thought to have fled across the Alps to Italy, just like Gerda Bormann did. Their first stop was usually in the South Tyrol region of northern Italy. Many Nazis stayed for some time in Catholic monasteries, mainly the monastery of the Teutonic Order in Murano, the Capuchin monastery near Bressanone, and the Franciscan monastery near Bolzano. This ratline became known as the monastery route and helped spark the myth that Pope Pius XII and the Vatican was the main protagonist in helping war criminals escape. It was not unthinkable after all. It was common knowledge that Pope Pius XII regarded communism as the single greatest threat to the Catholic Church and the Western world. In the South Tyrol, Nazis obtained letters from the priests and headed to Rome. These letters confirmed their identities. Of course, these identities were completely forged, but the letters helped them obtain a passport by the International Committee of the Red Cross without question. 120,000 papers were issued until 1951. Long before that, however, the Americans knew what was happening. In 1946, for example, there was a mass escape at a camp for prisoners of war in Rimini. As they worked to round up the escaped prisoners, American forces found that SS members were being sheltered in local monasteries and given Red Cross travel papers. Even before that, after the liberation of Rome by American forces, some Georgian priests received permission from the Pope to open a Georgian seminary in Rome. Months later, US forces noticed that many of these seminarians appeared to have girlfriends. Searching the seminary, they found the students were in reality hiding SS officers who appeared to be running a state-of-the-art radio station in the cellar. When analyzing the role of the Vatican in helping Nazis, the name of Alois Hudal is one of the most important. The Austrian bishop had clearly positioned himself as a Nazi sympathizer during Nazi rule, and later he said many of those persecuted were completely blameless, and that he did the right thing by giving them false identity papers. But of course, the closest and most logical destination was Spain, at the moment ruled by the iron fist of Generalissimo Francisco Franco. The lack of official records from the time makes it difficult to assert exactly how many Nazis were sheltered in Franco's Spain, but judging by the large number of neo-Nazi organizations that appeared throughout the country in the post-war years, it must have been many thousands. The leader of a Belgian Walloon SS leader, Léon de Grelle, was particularly vocal from his hideout in Malaga, Spain. He was never brought to justice for his war crimes, but he did stand trial in the 1980s for Holocaust denial charges. Stille Hilfe, helping Nazis get away with murder. Unlike Odessa, an organization known as Stille Hilfe or Silent Assistance was clearly established in Germany and other countries in the post-war years. Stille Hilfe was intended as a relief organization that helped arrested, condemned, and fugitive SS members. They did so by providing attorneys and legal assistance, but also logistics and help with going undercover. This organization helped hundreds, perhaps thousands of former SS members escape to South America and the Middle East. In 1951, Stille Hilfe became legally a non-profit organization, allowing for donations to be received. The founders' meeting was held in Munich, the place where the Nazi Party had started 3 decades before. From the beginning of the Nuremberg trials, the group had sought to influence public opinion to prevent the death penalty. In press campaigns, personal and open letters and petitions, the accused were usually represented as innocent victims. Legal assistance for arrested war criminals was first organized by the attorney Rudolf Aschenauer, who also formulated and submitted requests for grace and revisions. The organization fought for paid vacation, dismissal, and Christmas benefits to the prisoners, and also supported their families. They were not only limited to humanitarian activities, but also pursued ideological and revisionist objectives like holding rallies and petitioning to authorities. One of the main activities among Stille Hilfe members, however, was not publicized. It was the facilitation of escape for Nazi criminals. One of such escapees was Johann von Leers, a conspicuous member of the Waffen-SS and a known editor within the propaganda ministry. After the war, Leers fled from Germany to Italy, where he lived for 5 years. In 1950, he migrated to Argentina, where he continued his propaganda activities. During this period, he was a contributor to Der Weg, a Nazi publication founded in Buenos Aires in 1947. He was praised by Haj Amin al-Husseini, Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and a Nazi wartime ally, for his loyalty to Arab nationalism. This determined that Leers converted to Islam and moved to Egypt, where he worked closely with Abdel Nasser's government in editing texts and publications. Another SS captain that escaped thanks to Stille Hilfe was Erich Priebke. Priebke was infamous for his responsibility in the massacre of civilians in the Ardeatine caves near Rome. Around noon on the 24th of March 1944, 335 men went to the Ardeatine caves. All were tied with their hands behind their backs, and their names were read out loud. In groups of 5, they went into the caves. Priebke went inside together with the second or third group and shot a man with an Italian machine pistol. Toward the end, he shot another man with the same machine pistol. The executions ended before dark. After the shootings, explosives were used to shut the caves. Unlike others, he did not escape to Italy but to Latvia. From there, he boarded a ship and landed in Bariloche, Argentina, under the pseudonym Otto Pape. He managed to remain unidentified in Argentina for almost half a century, but was finally identified and extradited to Rome in 1995. 3 years later, he was sentenced to life in prison and died under house arrest on October 11, 2013. Walter Rauff invented the horrifying mobile gas chambers, in which exhaust fumes were fed directly into the back of redesigned vans. According to his arrest warrant, he was responsible for at least 97,000 murders. In 1949, he fled along the Rat Line together with his wife and 2 children to the Ecuadorian city of Quito, and later continued on to Chile. West Germany requested his extradition in 1963, but it was rejected as the crimes Rauff was accused of had expired under Chile's statute of limitations. Rauff became a wealthy food producer and died of a heart attack on May 14, 1984. After working for Volkswagen of Brazil for 16 years, Franz Stangl, enforcer of the T4 extermination program and SS commander, was caught in 1967. Before that, Stangl had been responsible for inspecting the gas chambers where hundreds of thousands were killed. He was notorious for his lack of remorse or empathy for his fellow human beings. This determined that he was employed in the death camps of Sobibor, Treblinka, and Trieste. After his arrest, he was scheduled to stand trial, but he died of heart failure in 1971 before receiving a sentence. Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death. In the case of some lower-ranked Nazis, their capture was considered too costly compared to the levity of their crimes. In other cases, like that of Josef Mengele, the crimes were so horrific that any expenses were only a small price to pay if the outcome was that they rotted in prison for the rest of their lives. Mengele was never a prominent figure. His name was shrouded in obscurity during the war, and only after the war his doings came to light. Only then the Allied powers learned that he was a sadist of the highest order who inflicted the utmost savageries in the name of science. For once, he was directly responsible for sorting out the people who would die in the gas chambers of Auschwitz and those who wouldn't. Old people, sick people, pregnant women and children were sent by Mengele directly to the chambers. It was the fit people he was interested in saving, at least for the time being. Those selected were stripped naked, their heads shaven, before being sent to the hospital so that Mengele could experiment on them. Mengele was interested in what he called racial hygiene, that is, finding out the physiologic reasons that made the Aryan race so superior to the rest of races. His experiments with twins are sadly known today. They were all treated as rats. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, healthy limbs were amputated, diseases injected, wounds infected on purpose. The objective was to study how the inferior human bodies reacted to pain, illness, and stress. When news came that Hitler had ceased to exist, Mengele joined a German army unit who was making their way into Bavaria, now in the American zone. Unarmed and confused, he and his unit were captured and taken to Schauenstein POW camp, 75 miles north of Nuremberg, where he was reunited with a friend of his, Dr. Keiler. His captors had absolutely no idea about what a big fish they had captured, especially as he told them his name was Joseph Memling. Besides this, almost every SS member had their blood group tattooed on their arms, but Mengele had refused to be tattooed. Thus, they just let him and Dr. Keiler go, thinking they were just regular doctors. He then traveled to Auschwitz to retrieve his field notes, which he considered important, and then he managed to cross the southern border into Italy, landing in Genoa in 1949. There he obtained a passport by the Red Cross with the name Helmut Gregor. In July 1949 he sailed to Argentina, where he established himself in the town of Vicente Lopez. There he worked as a carpenter and later as a salesman for farm equipment. Thinking he was off the hook, in Argentina he lived under his own name. In 1958 he was questioned, together with other doctors from the same area, on suspicion of practicing medicine without a license when a teenage girl died after an abortion. However, no charges were presented. Aware that the publicity could lead to his Nazi background and wartime activities being discovered, he took an extended business trip to Paraguay and was granted citizenship there in 1959 under the name José Mengele. Mengele's name was mentioned several times during the Nuremberg trials in the mid-1940s, but the Allied forces believed that he was probably already dead. It was the Mossad during the 1960s that began to track him. They were hoping to track down Mengele so that he too could be brought to trial in Israel. Their inquiries in Paraguay revealed no clues to his whereabouts, and they were unable to intercept any correspondence between Mengele and his wife Martha, who by this time was living in Italy. Agents who were working undercover in South America reached a rural area near Sao Paulo, where they identified a European man whom they believed to be Mengele. However, as they were not completely sure, the Mossad decided to call off the manhunt in 1962. This meant that one of the worst criminals in Nazi Germany, the so-called Angel of Death, lived a tranquil and easy life in southern Brazil for the rest of his life. He suffered a stroke while swimming and drowned in 1979. Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon. After the German conquest and occupation of the France, SS intelligence officer Klaus Barbie was assigned to Dijon. Later that year, he was transferred to Lyon, where he established his headquarters at the Hotel Terminus. He frequently had adult and children prisoners brought to him, so he could personally torture them at the hotel. He also trained German shepherds to bite and abuse male and female prisoners. His cruelty earned him the nickname Butcher of Lyon. It is estimated that Barbie was directly responsible for the deaths of 14,000 people in France. After the war, the French provisional government sentenced Barbie to death in absentia, as they did not know his whereabouts. Later, however, it was discovered that he had been under custody of the Americans, so the French petitioned for him to be handed over. The Americans had other ideas and instead helped him flee to Bolivia. Barbie lived for the following 30 years in Cochabamba, where he changed his name to Klaus Altmann. He collaborated with and reported to the American Counterintelligence Corps, who were very worried by the rise of communism in Latin America. Barbie also collaborated with the different military regimes both in Bolivia and in Peru, and frequently boasted about having participated in the hunt of freedom fighter Che Guevara. During one of his trips to Peru in 1971, he was identified by French Nazi hunters. As Bolivia did not have an extradition treaty with France, he felt he was safe. After his cover was blown, a French journalist flew to La Paz in 1972 to interview him, asking him if he was indeed Klaus Barbie. Klaus denied being other than Klaus Altmann, even when the journalist handed him pictures of people he had tortured, asking him if he knew them. He said he didn't, but handed the pictures back containing his fingerprints. This is how he got unmistakably identified, but still the government denied the extradition. 2 years later, a democratic government was elected, and Barbie was arrested and extradited to France to stand trial. In 1984, Barbie was indicted for crimes committed as Gestapo chief in Lyon between 1942 and 1944. The worst of his crimes was the so-called Rue Sainte-Catherine roundup, where he arrested 86 Jews and sent them to concentration camps. For this action, he chose a Tuesday because it was the day a Jewish federation gave free meals and medical assistance to those in need. First, he had the workers arrested and then proceeded to catch every person who entered the building. None of those people returned to their homes, but instead were shipped to Bergen-Belsen, Sobibor, and Auschwitz. Only 3 victims survived the concentration camps. On the 4th of July 1987, Barbie was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in Lyon of leukemia and spine and prostate cancer 4 years later at the age of 77. Barbie and Hertel comprised a small minority of the Nazi war criminals that American agencies such as the Counterintelligence Corps were to hire after the war. Others included Robert Jan Verbelen, a member of the Flemish SS who was responsible for the deaths of at least 101 people in terrorist actions in wartime Belgium. Verbelen personally carried out some of these assassinations, which even included hand grenade attacks on cafes and bars. In 1946, Verbelen was employed by the Counterintelligence Corps in Austria to help execute Project Newton, which was an operation to penetrate the Austrian Communist Party. Verbelen was granted Austrian citizenship in 1959, but 6 years later he was tried for war crimes. At that time he was acquitted, and Verbelen would remain a free man until his death in 1990. Verbelen's process showed 2 things. First, that Americans did not always have in their best interest to prosecute and punish war criminals. And second, that if Israeli Jews wanted them to pay for their crimes, they would have to take matters into their own hands. Herbert Küchers, the hangman of Riga, which was exactly what they did in the 1960s. Israel itself decided to act as judge, jury, and executioner. One of the first tasks that Israel's foreign intelligence agency, the Mossad, assumed was to hunt down and kill Herbert Küchers. Known as the Butcher of Riga, Küchers was accused of being personally responsible for the deaths of at least 30,000 Latvian Jews. Küchers' assassination, for which Israel would claim no responsibility, was calculated to publicize and punish his terrible crimes. It would also serve as a warning of the kind of rough justice that would be meted out to others if the other countries did not provide justice themselves. Küchers was a national hero in Latvia before the war. Known as the Latvian Lindbergh, the aviator had quite impressive feats to his name. He famously flew in 1933 from Latvia to the British African colony of the Gambia in an open cockpit aircraft he had cobbled together from cast-off and salvaged parts. 6 years later, in December 1939, he made a 3,000-mile or 5,000 kilometers expedition to Palestine. But that all changed after the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as the Soviets brutally occupied Latvia in the summer of 1940. A year later, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and Latvia came under Nazi rule. Some of Küchers' fellow countrymen viewed the Nazis as liberators, a view not shared by their terrified Jewish neighbours. Riga became a pen where Jews were hunted for sport and profit, and Herbert Küchers was an enthusiastic player in the game. During the occupation years, Küchers became second in command of the notorious Araj Commando, a 300-strong Latvian paramilitary group which enthusiastically participated in the murder of the country's Jews. They shot Jewish people in the streets just for fun. Küchers was recorded giving orders to his commandos during the Rumbula massacre on November 30th and December 8th, 1941, when roughly 25,000 Jews were murdered in or near the Rumbula forest. No wonder why after the Third Reich fell, he joined the Rat Line and escaped to South America. But unlike his fellow killers, Küchers arrived in Brazil under his own name and almost immediately began seeking out members of the country's Jewish community. Küchers pretended to be both a political exile who had been targeted by the communists and a man who had rescued Jews during the Holocaust, and apparently they believed him for a while. But a few years later, the past caught up with him. It was his narcissism that decided his faith, as keeping his name and being so vocal in the Rio Jewish community made the Mossad quite aware of his whereabouts. Still, the Mossad agents hoped that he would be tried for war crimes in Germany, but this did not happen, and in 1965, the Mossad lured him into a trap. One undercover Mossad Nazi hunter persuaded Kukurs of traveling to Uruguay under the pretense of starting an aviation business. It was an offer too good to be true, so Kukurs immediately jumped to the opportunity. His associate was named Anton Kunzler, fake name of Mossad agent Yakov Mehdad. Mehdad was a veteran Nazi hunter who had taken part in the capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina in 1960. In the summer of 1965, he cabled Kukurs from Montevideo. He was invited to a house in a remote suburb of the city that had just been rented by a man from Vienna. When Kukurs penetrated in the building, he was ambushed by a group of men. Kukurs fought back against his attackers and bit the finger of one of the hitmen so hard it was nearly severed. Ultimately, Kukurs was overwhelmed. He was subdued after one of the men hit him in the head with a hammer. Now helpless, Kukurs started pleading with the men to let him speak before they did anything else. He received no response and was promptly shot in the head twice with a suppressed automatic pistol, killing him instantly. His body, found in a trunk on the 6th of March, had several gunshot wounds elsewhere, and his skull was shattered. Next to his body, several documents were left pertaining to his involvement in the murder of Jews in the Riga ghetto. Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust. Adolf Eichmann's capture was not so straightforward as Kukurs. He did a good job covering his traces while he escaped to Argentina. It was his good manners that eventually betrayed him. Born in Solingen in 1906, he was a senior SS official when World War II started, and he took his job very seriously. His main task during the last years of World War II was to oversee the whole logistics of death camp deportations and to plan the genocide of all European Jews, according to the directives decided in the Wannsee Conference in 1942. As such, although he rarely visited the camps, he was responsible for the deaths of millions. On the 24th of December 1944, Eichmann fled Budapest just before the Soviets completed their encirclement of the capital. He returned to Berlin, where he arranged for incriminating records of his actions regarding the Holocaust to be burned. Along with many other SS officers who fled in the closing months of the war, Eichmann and his family were living in relative safety in Austria when the war in Europe ended on the 8th of May 1945. However, at the end of the war, Eichmann was captured by US forces and spent time in several camps for SS officers using forged papers that identified him as Otto Eckmann. He escaped from a work detail at Cham, Germany, when he realized that his identity had been discovered. Moreover, by that time, Rudolf Höss was testifying in the Nuremberg trials and incriminating Eichmann as the architect of the Holocaust. Eichmann knew he had to go farther. In 1948, Eichmann obtained a landing permit for Argentina and false identification under the name Ricardo Clement through the organization directed by Bishop Alois Hudal. He then followed the monastery route into Italy, and from there to Argentina, where he lived comfortably in a suburb of Buenos Aires called Olivos. Under his new identity, he made a career in the Mercedes-Benz production plant, where he eventually became head of department. His wife and children came to live with him shortly after he arrived in Argentina. One of his kids, Klaus, dated a German girl named Sylvia, whose father was a Dachau survivor. Klaus didn't know Sylvia was Jewish and made some tasteless comments about how the Nazis should have finished their job of exterminating inferior peoples. Unsurprisingly, the relationship ended very soon. The following year, Sylvia's father heard a report about a trial in Frankfurt of a Nazi war criminal, during which the name of Adolf Eichmann was mentioned as being instrumental in the destruction of the Jews. The surname gave Sylvia's father a jolt, as it was the same as that of Sylvia's former boyfriend. He immediately informed the public prosecutor in Frankfurt, Dr. Fritz Bauer, about his suspicions. Bauer wrote back demanding more information, especially the address of the man who might be Eichmann. But Sylvia's father could do little in this sense. The beatings he had received at Dachau in the mid-1930s had rendered him blind. Sylvia had to make some inquiries around Olivos, and eventually she was given the address of 4261 Chacabuco Street. One Sunday afternoon, she went to the bungalow and knocked on the door. Vera, Eichmann's wife, answered the door and informed her that Klaus was out, but wouldn't she wish to have a coffee and a slice of cake? Sylvia accepted, and soon the two women were joined by Eichmann himself. She asked if he was Klaus's father, but he replied that he was his uncle. A few minutes later, Klaus appeared in the kitchen and was very surprised to see his ex-girlfriend. He demanded that she abandon the house immediately, and Eichmann accompanied her and Klaus to the front door. Klaus then told his uncle that he would see Sylvia to the bus, but Eichmann said that it would be even more gentlemanly if Klaus escorted Sylvia back home. Klaus's reply would seal Eichmann's fate. "Thank you, father," he said. "I will take care of Sylvia and see to it that she gets home." Thanks to this confirmation, Sylvia and her father informed Dr. Bauer that Adolf Eichmann, the man responsible for designing the final solution, was hiding in plain sight in a Buenos Aires suburb. The only problem was, he did not consider this doubtful information enough to grant a full-scale investigation overseas. Simon Wiesenthal, the man who never forgets. Fortunately, one man did not give up so fast. It was Simon Wiesenthal, a Holocaust survivor who had been imprisoned in Janowska for almost 3 years, then in Krakow-Plaszow, and endured a death march from there to Mauthausen. After such harrowing experiences, Wiesenthal dedicated the rest of his life to the hunt of Nazi war criminals. In 1953, Wiesenthal learned from a letter shown to him that Eichmann had been seen in Buenos Aires, and he passed that information to the Israeli consulate in Vienna in 1954. When Eichmann's father died in 1960, Wiesenthal arranged for private detectives to surreptitiously photograph members of the family. Eichmann's brother Otto was said to bear a strong family resemblance, and there were no current photos of Eichmann. Wiesenthal provided these photographs to Mossad agents on the 18th of February. With these photographs, Mossad agents were able to confirm Eichmann's identity in Buenos Aires. Given Argentina's history of rejecting extradition requests for Nazi criminals, instead of filing a likely futile request, Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion decided that Eichmann should be captured and brought to Israel for trial. He dispatched an 8-man team in April 1960 to Argentina. The team captured Eichmann on the 11th of May 1960 near his home on Garibaldi Street in San Fernando, Buenos Aires. The agents had arrived in April and observed his routine for many days, noting that he arrived home from work by bus at about the same time every evening. They planned to seize him when he was walking beside an open field from the bus stop to his house. The plan was nearly abandoned on the designated day when Eichmann was not on the bus he usually took home, but he got off another bus about half an hour later. Mossad agent Peter Malkin engaged him, asking in Spanish if he had a moment. Eichmann was frightened and attempted to leave, but 2 more Mossad men came to Malkin's aid. The 3 wrestled Eichmann to the ground, and after a struggle, they moved him to a car where they concealed him on the floor under a blanket. Eichmann was taken to one of several Mossad safe houses that had been set up in Buenos Aires. He was held there for 9 days, during which time his identity was double-checked and confirmed. Near midnight on the 20th of May, Eichmann was sedated by Israeli anesthetist Yona Elian, who was part of the Mossad team and dressed as a flight attendant. He was smuggled out of Argentina aboard an Israeli plane. Eichmann was taken to a fortified police station at Yagur in Israel, where he spent 9 months. There he was subject to daily interrogations before standing trial on the 11th of April 1961. He was indicted on 15 criminal charges, including crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes against the Jewish people, and membership in a criminal organization. Eichmann was hanged at a prison in Ramla a few minutes past midnight on the 1st of June 1962, and Wiesenthal became a national hero. In the following years, Wiesenthal's relentless pursuit of Nazis took many forms. He founded the Jewish Historical Documentation Center in Austria, where he gathered information on war criminals and assisted refugees. He meticulously documented atrocities, interviewed survivors, and used media attention to keep the hunt for Nazis in the public eye. He believed in holding all perpetrators accountable, from camp guards to collaborators. This way, he gained fame as ruthless and unforgiving, and since the early 1960s, his name became synonymous with Nazi hunting. Nominated 4 times for the Nobel Peace Prize, the recipient of a British knighthood, the United States Presidential Medal of Freedom, the French Légion d'honneur, and at least 53 other distinctions, Wiesenthal's standing is that of a secular saint. He is credited with some 1,100 hunted Nazis, but his reputation is built on sand. He was a liar, and a bad one at that. From the end of the war to the end of his life in 2005, he would lie repeatedly about many of his Nazi hunting exploits. He would also concoct outrageous stories about his war years and make false claims about his academic career. Nevertheless, his figure is a complex and important one, and despite his little regard for truthfulness, he proved to be a valuable asset in the trial and punishment of dozens of Nazis. Nazi criminals in Syria and Egypt. In 1948, just 3 years after the end of World War II, a leading Nazi war criminal managed to escape from a prison in Linz, Austria. It was Franz Stangl, commander of the Sobibor and Treblinka extermination camps, responsible for the deaths of almost 1 million Jews. Via Graz, Murano and Florence, he made his way to Rome. In Rome, Bishop Alois Hudal, a fellow Austrian, greeted him with kindness. He then handed Stangl forged documents that allowed the Nazi war criminal to travel to Syria, where his family eventually joined him. In 1951, the Stangl family emigrated to Brazil, but he had inadvertently opened a new and valuable escape route for Nazis, the Middle East. Alois Brunner, one of the vilest Holocaust perpetrators, was at that moment still at large. During the war, Brunner was a high-ranking Gestapo official, Adolf Eichmann's number 2, and head of the Gestapo's Department for Jewish Affairs. Known as a troubleshooter for extermination, Brunner and his closest associates personally oversaw the arrest, deportation and murder of tens of thousands of Jews in France, Slovakia, Greece and other countries. Eichmann defined Brunner as his best man. After the war, Brunner hid for a short while in Germany, but in 1954 he felt the noose was tightening around his neck, especially when a French court sentenced him to death in absentia. With the help of Nazi friends, he followed Stangl's path and escaped to Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt. That began a Middle Eastern sojourn that ended only with his death, half a century later. Though Nasser employed several German experts in the fields of military and rocket science, as well as some propagandists and experts to domestic security, he had no need of genocide specialists. With the help of Amin al-Husseini, the former Mufti of Jerusalem and a guardian angel of Nazis throughout the Middle East, Brunner escaped to Syria, received a work visa, and joined the thriving scene of Nazi arms traders in Damascus in 1955. In Damascus, he bonded with fellow Nazi fugitives, most importantly Franz Rademacher, the former expert for Jewish affairs of the Nazi Foreign Office, and Dr. Wilhelm Beisner, a notorious German spy who was supposed to exterminate the Jews of Palestine after Germany's victory. Together, they founded a company named Orient Trading Company. This company was a front for a highly profitable business of arms, smuggling from the Eastern Bloc to the Algerian underground, the National Liberation Front in its war of liberation against French colonial rule. Brunner enriched himself greatly in this business, but in 1959 his luck was about to run out. Unbeknownst to him, Syrian intelligence agents were watching his activity, and they were not happy about it. On an unknown date in late 1959, Brunner was arrested and brought into a secluded facility that was used for torturing and interrogate prisoners of war. Believing he was a foreign spy, his interrogators accused him of drug smuggling and ordered him arrested until the end of the investigation. Knowing full well that he may not get out of the facility alive, Brunner tried his last card. He told the Syrians that he was being hunted because he was an enemy of the Jews. The Syrian captain's attitude suddenly changed. He rose up and shook Brunner's hand. "Welcome to Syria," he beamed. "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." From that day, Brunner served the Syrian regime in different capacities. During the 1980s and 1990s, the regime in Damascus kept on protecting him, answering numerous extradition requests from Austria, West Germany, and the United States, with the repetitive reply that no such person existed in Syria. And yet, following the highly effectual media campaigns of the Nazi hunters Serge and Beta Klaas-Fled against Brunner, the regime became embarrassed by his presence in the capital. After all, he had long outlived his usefulness. The regime in Damascus had increasingly limited Brunner's movements throughout the 1980s and 1990s, especially after he violated the president's direct instructions to keep a low profile by giving repeated interviews to the German, Austrian, and international media. The Syrian government had finally decided to get rid of Brunner in 1996, ordering him removed from his apartment and jailed indefinitely in an underground cell below the Muhajirun police station. The door was closed, and never opened again. Brunner spent his final years in misery and squalor. He supposedly died in 2010. Until their last breath, catching Nazi criminals in the 21st century, Wiesenthal, Bauer, and other Nazi hunters never gave up. Over the years, they brought to justice thousands of Nazi war criminals and collaborators. However, given the time passed since the crimes committed, hunting Nazis in the 21st century has become a race against the clock. Even the youngest Nazis who were in their 20s during the war are now 90 years old. In 2018, for example, 94-year-old Johann Rechbogen, who had served in Stutthof between 1942 and 1944, was identified and brought to trial. He was tried by a juvenile court in Münster because at the age when he committed the crimes he was not 21 yet. He was accused of murdering more than 100 Polish prisoners and 77 Soviet POWs using Zyklon B gas. In 2019, another SS guard named Bruno Day was convicted of contributing to the killing of more than 5,000 prisoners at a death camp between 1944 and 1945. He was 93 years old. These Nazis were found and brought to trial after so many years, thanks to the endless efforts of the people who work at a tiny office in Ludwigsburg in southwestern Germany. It is called the Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes and has been in use since 1958. Their goal is to find the last living Nazis who have yet to be indicted and might still be able to stand trial. Central Office prosecutors unearth the names of about 30 living perpetrators per year. Their cases are then handed over to regional prosecutors, who usually spend another year conducting follow-up investigations and deciding whether to take the individuals to court. Since the start of the 21st century, this work has led to 6 prosecutions, including the ones mentioned earlier. Today, the youngest suspects are 90 years old, and most were low-level Nazi functionaries, guards, cooks, medics, telephone operators, and the like. Most of the defendants die during the lengthy judicial process, so the odds of conviction are very small. In 2013, for instance, the Central Office prepared the Auschwitz list, consisting of 30 living former Auschwitz personnel who could be immediately tried. Of these, only 5 cases made it to court because the others died or were deemed unfit to stand trial. But the success of the Central Office is not explained by the number of convictions, but by the fact that their very existence makes the lives of former Nazi criminals unbearable. They live every day knowing that the full weight of the law could finally reach them, wherever they are. The Central Office keeps the memory of the millions of people who died or suffered at the hands of the criminal regime that ruled Germany between 1933 and 1945, a memory so gruesome and incredible that it needs to be kept alive no matter how many years have passed. In the last days of World War II, when everything seemed lost for Germany, thousands of Nazis felt relief when they managed to sneak through the Allied armies and cross the border. They thought they had evaded a dark fate and could now live their lives under a different identity. But they were wrong. Thanks to the tireless efforts of undercover spies, Mossad agents, important figures such as Simon Wiesenthal, and state prosecutors, there was no place in the world where they were really safe. Even Adolf Eichmann, who never gave up his fake identity and lived in a country with no extradition treaty, was publicly hanged in Jerusalem. One thing was certain: the long arm of the law would one day or another reach them and show no mercy, just as they did with Jews and other prisoners at the death camps.